Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. Angela Crawley.
The Prime Minister's plans for English... Sorry, question one. Not there.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the whole House will wish to join with me, indeed the whole House, in congratulating the England women's football team on reaching the semi-finals of the World Cup in Canada and wishing them well for their match against Japan this evening. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Angela Crawley.
The Prime Minister's plans for English votes for English laws will reduce my rights and the rights of other Scottish MPs in this House.
Order. The Honourable Lady must and will be heard. Angela Crawley.
The Prime Minister's plans for English votes for English laws will reduce my rights and the rights of other Scottish MPs in the House of Commons. But the real issue is my ability to protect the interests of my constituents of Lanark and Hamilton East. Will the Prime Minister guarantee today that under his plans, a bill that has a direct or indirect effect on Scotland's budget will not be certifiable as England only?
Well, first of all, let me welcome the Honourable Lady to her place. What I would say to her is we will publish our proposals shortly, and Parliament will have plenty of time to consider and vote on them. But let me be very clear, we are not creating a system of two tiers for MPs. All MPs will still vote on all bills. But what we're saying is that laws which only apply in England should only pass if they're supported by a majority of English MPs. That seems to me, in a devolved system where Scottish MSPs can determine their own future on health, on housing and on an increasing number of subjects, fairness across our United Kingdom.
Harriet Harman.
Can I join the Prime Minister in his congratulations to England's women's football team with only a fraction of the resources the men get? They are showing the men how it's done. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, we now know that 22 British citizens have been confirmed dead in the Tunisia attack. Our thoughts are with the bereaved and injured and the help they and their families will need. The bereaved and those who've experienced life-changing injuries and trauma will need long-term practical and emotional support. The experience after 7/7 was that to really help those affected families, there needs to be coordination across departments and agencies. So will he establish a dedicated task force reporting to a minister to support those who've suffered in this terrible attack?
Well, yes, I can give the Right Honourable Lady that assurance. Let me update the House, because I'm sad to say that the confirmed number of British citizens killed in this appalling attack is now 27, and as we've said, we do expect it to rise still further. Today we're repatriating 8 bodies from Tunisia on an RAF C-17 plane. That plane is now in the air and it will land at RAF Bryce Norton this afternoon. Every family of a victim now has a dedicated Foreign Office liaison officer, but I can confirm what she asked, and I've asked the Cabinet Secretary for advice on creating a ministerial committee to ensure that work is properly coordinated right across government to provide all the support that the victims of this appalling attack deserve, and also to make sure that as a nation we mark and commemorate this event appropriately.
Will he stand up for Britain's interests, or will he just be bullied by Boris?
I would have thought, with all her years of experience, the Right Honourable Lady would know not to believe everything that she reads in her morning's newspapers. It would probably be good for her blood pressure as well as good for mine if she didn't. But let me give the mildest warnings of jumping to a conclusion before seeing the results, because we had a classic example of it last week when the Shadow Health Secretary warned the government that the poverty figures would make us all hang our heads in shame. That was, of course, before the poverty figures were published, showing that relative poverty was at its lowest level since the 1980s.
He seems to be keen to get off the issue of airports. It seems like he's in a holding pattern above Heathrow and that Boris won't let him land.
Simon Hoare. Speaker. Angus Robertson.
Mr. Speaker, I associate myself and the Scottish National Party with all the tributes and condolences to the families and friends of everybody caught up with the tragedy in Tunisia. Mr. Speaker, because of the way the United Kingdom is structured, decisions on health, on education, and much English legislation has an impact on the Scottish budget. Will the Prime Minister confirm that he plans to exclude Scottish MPs from parts of the democratic process at Westminster that will have an impact on Scotland?
The point I would make to the honourable gentleman is that English MPs are entirely excluded from any discussion of Scottish health or Scottish housing or Scottish education. What we are proposing is actually a very measured and sensible step, which says that when there is a bill that only affects, for instance, England, the committee stage should be of English MPs, but then the whole House will vote at report stage and indeed at third reading stage. What this is going to introduce, as it were, is a system for making sure that the wishes of English MPs cannot be overruled. That, I think, is only fair in a system when the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Parliament and indeed the Northern Irish Parliament have increased powers.
Angus Robertson.
Mr. Speaker, on overruling MPs, it's very interesting, Mr. Speaker, because on the Scotland Bill, 58 of 59 Scottish MPs have voted for that legislation to be strengthened, and they've been outvoted by English. Not content with outvoting Scottish MPs elected on a mandate to strengthen the Scotland Bill, he is now going to introduce second-class status for us as MPs elected from Scotland on issues which can impact on the Scottish budget. He's even planning to make the membership of the Scottish Affairs Select Committee a minority pursuit for Scottish MPs. Is this what the Prime Minister means when he says there's a respect agenda?
I'll tell you what I mean by a respect agenda, which is every single thing Lord Smith represented in terms of welfare has gone into the bill. And isn't it interesting that he objects to a vote in the UK Parliament on a UK issue, which is what has happened? But let me say this to him again. Instead of endlessly talking about the process, isn't it time that the SNP started to talk about how they're going to use these powers? Why don't you start tell us? Which welfare benefits do you want to put up? Which taxes do you want to increase? Why don't you start to tell us? And I've been following this debate very closely. I notice, Mr. Speaker, none of Scotland's 59 MPs are arguing that the state pension should be devolved. In other words, the principle of pooling and sharing our resources and risks across the United Kingdom, which I believe in as leader of the United Kingdom, is apparently shared by the Scottish National Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Paul Short from Wooler, showed great courage during the Tunisian massacre last week by helping save the life of an injured victim with first aid skills he'd learned as a member of the Territorial Army. Can the Prime Minister set out how the new measures in the extremism bill will tackle extremists and stand up for our values of democracy, equality, free speech and respect for minorities?
Well, first of all, let me take the opportunity of praising her constituent and the skills that were used on that dreadful day in Tunisia. What our bill will do is reinforce the work we've already done to increase funding into counter-terrorism and counter-terrorism policing, to make sure we have this duty on public authorities to combat radicalisation, but then to go after this issue of the fact that there are groups and individuals who are very clever at endorsing extremism but stopping one step short of actually condoning terrorism. And that's what these new banning orders that we're looking at are aimed to achieve, because we are clear that people that support the extremist narrative, they've got no place in our public debate. And let me just share with the House one statistic which I think is important. Under the last Labour government, the number of working... I know you don't want to talk about the last Labour government. Right. Well, under the last government, inequality fell. Child poverty fell. Right. Now for the history lesson. Let's go back to the last Labour government. Under Labour, the number of working-age people in in-work poverty rose by around 20%. Now, that was at the same time that welfare spending on people in work went up from £6 billion to £28 billion. What this shows is the Labour model of taking money off people in tax, recycling it back to them in tax credits, hasn't worked. It's time for a new approach of creating jobs, cutting taxes, and having businesses that are creating the livelihoods we need.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having led a campaign and authored a letter signed by over 120 members of Parliament from across the House to the Prime Minister and to the BBC not to call the so-called Islamic State ISIL or ISIS, I thank the Prime Minister for not calling it an Islamic State, but the issue remains by calling it ISIL. Can the Prime Minister lead the way by officially calling it Daesh, as do France, Turkey and other countries of the Middle East, and which is acceptable to Muslims in this country and around the world?
I think my honourable friend, who's spoken about this a lot, makes a very strong point. The argument I would make is that Islamic State is inappropriate because this is neither Islamic in the true meaning of the word, nor indeed is a state. It is a bunch of terrorist thugs. So I'm happy for people to use Daesh. I think ISIL is an alternative because it doesn't confer such authority. And I'm pleased that the BBC seem to have moved their position because until yesterday they were calling it Islamic State, and it looks like they're going to change their approach, and I really welcome that.
Question 5, closed question, Mr Graham Allen.
Number 5, Mr Speaker.
I regularly reflect on Prime Minister's questions with Cabinet colleagues and others. For all its faults, and there are many, I would say that it has two important points. First of all, it puts the Prime Minister on the spot to the public, but it also, I would say, puts the government on the spot to the Prime Minister, as it's an important mechanism of accountability, needing to know issues from right across every department before coming to the House at 12 o'clock on a Wednesday.
Mr Graham Allen.
Given that Parliament may be moving out of this place in 2020, would the Prime Minister take this opportunity to share the joys of Prime Minister's questions that he's just outlined and this federal Parliament by convening it in each of the nations of the United Kingdom and thereby symbolise his government and this Parliament's commitment to both the Union and to devolution?
Well, as I've said in an earlier answer, I'm committed to trying to cut the cost of politics, and I'm not sure that would help. I think it is important that we take our politics and issues to all the different regions of the country, and that is something the government is very committed to do, not least with our regional economic plans for every region of our country. As for the future of this House of Commons and where we stand and where we debate, that is a matter for the House of Commons, but I have to say I have a slight emotional attachment to this place, this one specifically.
Mr Richard Benyon.
The brass fittings on that dispatch box are worn paper thin by the sweat on the palms of Prime Ministers and Ministers down the ages, and it is a visual example of parliamentary accountability. And while our constituents rightly feel that at times this session is a little absurd, does my right honourable friend agree that it would be a great pity if senior members of the executive were not held to account in that way?
I agree with my honourable friend. I remember taking some constituents on a tour when I first became a Member of Parliament and hearing for the first time something I hadn't known, which is, of course, when this chamber was bombed, some of the most important speeches and parliamentary occasions of Winston Churchill actually took place in the other place rather than here. But I don't want to start a complete fight between both houses, so I think I'll leave it at that.
Neil Gray.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister has now been asked repeatedly about his plans to exclude Scottish MPs from decisions that will directly and indirectly impact on Scotland's budget and my constituents in Airdrie Shotts. Will he finally tell this House and the people of Scotland whether it is right to create a second-class status for Scottish MPs through the back door, or is he content to press ahead with plans that will bring about the breakup of Britain?
Prime Minister.
I have to say, Mr Speaker, I'm quite baffled. I thought the whole point of the SNP is they wanted to exclude themselves from the UK Parliament forever. I thought that was the whole point. But actually what we're putting in place is a fair and balanced system that is fair to all parts of our United Kingdom, and long may it stay together.
Mr. Speaker, can I strongly urge the Prime Minister that after 4 opportunities he still hasn't answered the question regarding the impact of English votes for English laws? Can the Prime Minister finally reassure the people of my constituency that an elected MP will not be given minority status in matters that will affect the Scottish budget and consequently the lives of the citizens of Dundee? And moreover, last night 50 out of 59 Scottish MPs...
We're very grateful because we have got the gist of it, honestly. The Honourable Gentleman, Prime Minister.
What I say to the Honourable Gentleman is he has had a very clear answer. Maybe the SNP don't like this answer, but the proposals that we discussed at great length in the last Parliament for solving this issue will now be introduced. And the absolutely key point I would make is that if in some future Parliament there's disagreement between English MPs who want one thing and the House of Commons as a whole that wants another thing, there would have to be a way of resolving this deadlock. This is effectively a block for English MPs. It is not the ability to legislate willy-nilly, and he should know that if he reads the manifesto.
Jack Lepresti!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister feel comfortable that a Conservative government has implemented a spending target on foreign aid but will not commit to a target of a minimum of 2% of GDP on defence? And does he realise that this is damaging the relationship with our key strategic ally, the United States, and risking our credibility with our NATO allies?
Well, what I say to my honourable friend, who I know cares deeply about this issue and also has in his constituency some of the most important defence manufacturers in our country, is that we have in every year met that 2% target. And that's in a European Union where many countries don't even meet a 1% amount for investing in defence. The commitment we've made already is to invest £160 billion across 10 years into our equipment programme with real terms increases every year. And that is why we can say the aircraft carriers, the C-17s, the new aeroplanes, all will be coming forward. We will obviously make final spending decisions in the spending review this autumn.
Mr. Dennis Skinner.
For a man who seemingly is never away from Europe, why is it that he's never took the opportunity when he's been there to put in a claim for state aid to save British miners' jobs? He's the man who, during the election campaign, masqueraded as the workers' champion, and he hasn't got the guts to help those miners. He took £700 million out of the mine workers' pension scheme, and he's not given a penny back. No wonder they call him Dodgy Dave, the man that went to Eton, educated beyond his intelligence.
Well, it's very good to see the Labour Party in full voice cheering on Jurassic Park. I would stick to the movie. But there's a serious point here. This government has offered £20 million to the owners of Hatfield Colliery to keep that colliery going. So we have been prepared to put forward money, and unlike the last government, we've been prepared to make ministerial directions because we've got some courage when it comes to these things.
Last but not least, Clive Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The North and Suffolk NHS Mental Health Trust, which serves my constituency, is refusing to publish the so-called Alexander report into its operations. The report, which I've seen, raises serious questions about patient safety and care due to cuts to services. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the duty of candour should apply equally to NHS management as it does to NHS frontline staff? And if so, would he join me to call for its publication?
Prime Minister.
Well, first of all, let me welcome the honourable gentleman to this House. I make no apology for the CQC's rigorous inspection regime, which is identifying areas that need improvement. I would argue the two things we need here is to uncover bad practice and turn it round, but then to back that up with the resources that the NHS needs, including those recommended by the Stevens Plan. And as things stand, it's only this party that's backing that extra £8 billion into the NHS and not the party opposite.